This episode of Warrior Radio is brought to you by our web store, which you can find at warrior.do/store. We provide tools to hack consciousness and upgrade the mind. And one of the more popular products in our store is Warrior Kratom. And kratom, it comes from the leaves of a tropical evergreen tree native to Southeast Asia. And for hundreds of years, natives of Thailand, Malaysia, and Indonesia have chewed on its leaves to relieve minor pain, lift mood, aid in relaxation, and boost energy. And for the past few years, I've actually lived in Bali, Indonesia. And Indonesia, it's actually the largest exporter of kratom in the world. So living in the kratom mecca, I've reached out to every kratom farmer I could find and tried all the different strains I can get my hands on. And I'm offering the very best kratom I've found out here, which is again great for relieving minor pain, promoting relaxation, and supporting a balanced mood. And personally, my favorite is the Bali Red, which is just amazing for relaxing at the end of your day, which I personally use about twice a week. Use the coupon code RADIO to get 10% off all our consciousness hacking technology and mind enhancing herbs. In this episode of Warrior Radio, I sit down with Dr. Andrew Gallimore, PhD, who is a chemist, pharmacologist, and computational neurobiologist at the Okinawa Institute of Science and Technology in Japan. And he's one of the world's most knowledgeable researchers on the topic of DMT, the brain, and just the nature of consciousness itself. And he's really been making waves with a paper he and Dr. Rick Strassman actually published not too long ago in Frontiers in Psychology, which is essentially a proof of concept of how DMT could be administered using techniques from anesthesiology to prolong the DMT experience for up to hours or even days. And, you have to ask yourself, why would you want to prolong the experience? And although the DMT experience could feel like hours, in reality, the experience only lasts a handful of minutes. So by drip feeding DMT into subjects, you could really maintain levels of the chemical in the brain, allowing for some really, really interesting areas of research. For example, you could analyze the brain under something like an fMRI scanner to see what areas of the mind are active during the experience. Now, for a lot of people, there's accounts of making contact with alien beings and elves from advanced civilizations in higher dimensions of reality. So with DMT, so by extending the DMT experience, we could actually explore the legitimacy of these accounts. Maybe we could communicate with these beings for longer stretches of time and actually study if there's any legitimacy to these accounts. So Andrew, he's also known for a paper he published called Building Alien Worlds, where he explores DMT, the brain, and the nature of reality. And he talks about how the connectivity patterns in various systems of the brain actually alter under a DMT experience, allowing to possibly perceive information from higher dimensions of reality. And this could really explain how we're able to communicate possibly with these alien beings from, again, higher dimensions of reality. And all of this may sound something out of a science fiction movie, but Andrew is actually putting in serious work into studying the legitimacy of all of this from the lens of science. And it's one of the most fascinating interviews I've had on this podcast. And if you enjoy this episode, be sure to subscribe to the podcast Warrior Radio. Subscribe, give us a rating, tell a friend, and we can get these little known, little understood topics out into the public. Okay, with all that said, let's dive into today's episode with Dr. Andrew Gallimore. Enjoy. For those that don't know, can you tell us who you are and what you do?
Yeah, my name's Andrew Gallimore. I'm a chemist, a chemical pharmacologist, and a computational neurobiologist. I currently do computational neurobiology research at a university in Japan, in Okinawa, the Okinawa Institute of Science and Technology, as well as on the side spending pretty much most of my spare time thinking about and writing about psychedelic drugs, DMT, of course, in particular.
Yeah, and that's how I found out about you. For those that don't know, you have an awesome YouTube channel for that you guys should check out. But can you tell us a little bit about your backstory, just a little bit about your personal journey, how you eventually got into this field and really started to study psychedelics?
Yeah, I mean, I became interested in psychedelics when I was probably around 14 or 15. I remember I was at a friend's house, an old school friend, and it was a Saturday afternoon, and I was leafing through his bookshelf, and I found a book called Alternative London, believe it or not, and it had a little set. It was kind of one of these underground kind of books. And it had a section on psychedelic drugs, and I was leafing through it, and I was familiar with, LSD and mushrooms, and this small section of this drug I'd never heard of before called DMT. And it said that it was this, very brief 15-minute trip, kind of like LSD, it said. Of course, we know that's rather inaccurate, but so I thought, well, this is interesting. A drug that you can take and it only lasts, literally a few minutes. So this is fascinating. This is pre-internet. Well, actually, it was just as the internet. I think my friend was the only guy that I knew that had the internet. We certainly didn't have it at home at that time. So I spent some time, researching DMT, and there wasn't really much information available even on the internet at that time. I remember going to the library and trying to work out what DMT actually stood for. And apparently DMT also stands for dimethyl terephthalate, which is like a plastic. So that's for a couple of weeks, that's what I thought DMT stood for. And then I began, spending more and more time becoming interested in psychedelics. Really, from that point on, became familiar with Terence McKenna. This was in the sort of the Dolphin Tapes day, where you had to send off for cassette tapes in order to listen to Terence McKenna. But a friend, I was at school, and a friend passed me this magazine, and in the back page, it had this interview with Terence McKenna, who I didn't know at that time, and certainly didn't know that he was a huge fan of DMT, and it mentioned DMT. So I went out and I went to W.H. Smith, which is was the bookshop kind of that everyone went to back in those days, and ordered all the books that I could find that Terence McKenna had written. So I ordered True Hallucinations, I ordered Food of the Gods was the other one I ordered, and kind of consumed them. And then from that point on, I began sort of collecting books on psychedelics. And this was kind of the time when I was kind of finishing high school. So I was starting to think about, what I was going to study at university. And so, I thought I would study chemistry. And so, because that seemed to me the way to go. If you're interested in these drugs, is to study, how they are built, if you like. But when I eventually went to university, I did a master's in chemistry with pharmacology as well, so that I could understand not only the drugs but also the way that they interface with the human body, the way that they interface with the brain and consciousness. Whilst after I finished my degree, I then went to Cambridge and to pursue my PhD work, and there I looked more at the construction of complex molecules inside microorganisms, but still maintaining this interest in psychedelics. And it wasn't until probably 2012 when I wrote a paper this was the first important paper that I wrote, Building Alien Worlds, which really brought together all of my thinking about DMT over the last 10, 15 years, and actually in some sort of coherent model for kind of understanding what DMT does. And from there, I've given quite a few lectures on the subject and written a number of follow-up papers, and currently just about finishing the first draft of a book on DMT.
And I'd love to get into the meat and potatoes of some of the paper that you wrote. But before we dive into just the nitty-gritty of DMT, I wanted to set a foundation in the same way you started many of your talks and just discuss how the brain constructs and perceives reality. So can you take us through just briefly how the brain sort of takes in information from our environment and processes it and feeds us back this subjective reality that we actually experience?
Sure. Well, I mean, people assume, there's a lot of kind of sort of naive interpretations of what the brain is doing. People don't often think about exactly how perception works or how your world works, really. People kind of think of your world as something that just is out there, that you see, but people don't really often think what that actually means. But actually, your world is constructed by your brain. This is not fringe science. This is absolutely the case. Your world is built by your brain. And it's built from information. Your brain is an information processor and it's an information generator. And so every moment of your waking life, and even of every moment of your dream life, or indeed at the peak of a psychedelic experience, the peak of a DMT trip, these worlds are constructed by your brain. And your brain essentially learns to build a stable and predictable model of the world. And this enables you to kind of survive and flourish in whatever is out there. But the idea that we have access to, the real world, what Immanuel Kant would call the noumenon, is really an illusion. We live in a simulacrum, really, in a reality that is built by your brain. And so this then raises the question, for me anyway, is well, how did the brain learn to build this world, and what is the relationship between the phenomenal world, i.e. the world that is built by your brain, and the external world? And the answer is that the brain is constantly receiving information from the external world, whatever that means, and it is, if you like, using that information to kind of amplify this ongoing information in the brain. So the brain is constantly generating this information, which is your world, and information from the external world, what we would call sensory information, merely kind of modulates and constrains the world that is built always by your brain. Does that make sense?
Yes, definitely. And then, from what I understand, the perceived reality that our brains constructs and that what we experience is actually the result of only a small percentage of the sensory data from actual reality around us. So, can you talk a little bit about this idea?
Sure. Yeah. So what the brain has to learn to do is select information that is adaptive. In evolution terms, what you call adaptive, useful information, right? Functional information from all the information that it is receiving at any point in time. And so the brain uses something called sensory matching, where information from the external world is matched to ongoing information generation. So the ongoing information generation by the brain, what we call the intrinsic information, which is the information from which your world is built, always provides the context for any sensory information. And any sensory information that doesn't match the information being generated by a brain is basically ignored. It's filtered out. So the brain it's a selector, it's a filterer of information from the external world, rather than kind of just this blind accumulator of information.
And this other data that's out there that the brain isn't really processing, a lot of that is sort of connected with DMT and our ability to perceive that type of data that we normally don't have access to, which, like I was saying before the talk, is fascinating, some of the lectures that you've given on this. But in comparison, when we're, say, dreaming, how is our brain constructing our experience? And, how similar in terms of brain activity is this dream state versus waking state?
This is a really interesting question. And again, there's often this false dichotomy that people distinguish between the real and the non-real. People say if something is a hallucination or unreal, they say it's all in your head. And so this idea that something that's in your head is not real, whereas something outside is. But actually, all worlds are built by a brain. They're all in your head. And in fact, the brain builds your world during dreaming in exactly the same way as it does during waking. And in fact, the brain activity is extremely similar. There are some differences. There are certain parts of the brain, for example, that are shut down during dreaming. So the back part of the brain, or what are called the primary sensory cortices, these are the parts of the brain that receive information directly from the outside world. These are shut down. This stops you being awoken by information from the outside world. And also the front part of the brain, the frontal lobes, which are normally responsible for critical function. Those are the parts of the brain that will notice strange things in the environment. When you're 1 second you're sitting in the front garden, the next second you're on an airplane. And if that happened in real life, you would notice there was something very, very strange going on here. But in a dream, you don't notice you lose that critical function. But actually, the brain is building. Normally, dreams are continuous with waking, in that the dream world is built in exactly the same way as the real world is, and it's built from the same information. The brain has learned through the processes of evolution, development, and experience. The brain has been sculpted such that it knows how to build this world, and really, this should be the only kind of world your brain knows how to build. This is what we call the consensus world, the normal, waking, phenomenal world. And so when you go to sleep at night and you start dreaming, your brain is just building that same world. Yes, there's slightly less constraint. The brain has more freedom. That's why the dream world is more kind of fluid and can shift and move from scene to scene, and can even become quite bizarre at times. But actually, they're normally, in its gross form, the dream world is the same as the waking world. And so people have actually gone as far as to say, which I think is quite accurate, is that your waking world is in fact a dream, but it is constrained by information that's coming into the brain from the external world. During dreaming, that information is cut off, but the brain is still perfectly capable of building your phenomenal world in almost crystalline precision. The brain knows how to build this world.
And the DMT state is different. So you said that the connectivity patterns in various systems of the brain under DMT, where additional extrinsic information, it's suddenly sort of accessible for us to experience, which is very much different from just the normal waking state without DMT in the brain. So can you explain this?
Yeah, this is where my position diverges from what would be called orthodox neuroscience. So this is where I get into very speculative territory. So, everything I've said so far is perfectly sound, accepted neuroscience. However, as soon as you start saying that DMT allows you to access information from, let's say an alternate reality, then you're in very, very shaky territory. And most scientists, without even thinking about it, would say, no, that's nonsense. DMT is just a hallucination. So really, my position has always been, well, okay, let's assume that the DMT world is just a hallucination. Let's try and frame that from a standard. From the standard neuroscientific paradigm. Does that make sense? I would say. How does it make sense that DMT is just a hallucination? When you look at the DMT worlds, remember that your brain has learned to construct the consensus world over millions of years, really, of evolution, development, and experience. And as you said, this is achieved by molding the connectivity between what are called cortical columns in the brain. So this allows the brain to generate certain patterns of activity, certain patterns of information that generate this world. So your brain has learned to build this world because it's constantly receiving information, and it is also adapting and evolving and learning to build a stable and predictable model of the world. So your brain wasn't dropped to earth ready to construct this world, and it's not a passive process like a video camera where you can put anything in front of the camera and get a beautiful picture. The brain is actively constructing the world, and it has to learn how to do that. So my question is, if the DMT world is just a hallucination, how is it possible that your brain knows how to construct these worlds that have no relationship whatsoever to what we would call the consensus world, with crystalline clarity and with great regularity, not only within a user who's using it multiple times, but between users. Why do people say, "Oh, I went to that place too. I saw this dome. I met this particular creature. Oh, I've seen him as well. And oh, I had this experience. I went to this place." Constantly, you see these commonalities between experiences, and that also confounds me. Why not only is the brain able to build this world, this bizarre reality with apparently more dimensions than the consensus world, but other people's brains seem to be building the same world. To me, that's confounding, unless the brain is in fact receiving information from what we would call this orthogonal dimension, if you like, of reality that we normally don't have any access to. Now, if you accept that, there's nothing wrong with saying that there are parallel universes or alternate dimensions. That's perfectly fine. What the real trouble comes with, how does the brain access that information? Because traveling to an alternate reality is all about receiving information from that reality. Your brain has to receive information. You don't physically have to go somewhere. In order to enter the DMT world, all that has to happen is the DMT has to change the brain such that it can sort of gate access to this information towards which it didn't normally have access. So that's the idea.
And you explained this in a really clear way through this computer game by John Conway called The Game of Life. And I know we're kind of constrained with time, but can you briefly explain this for those that haven't heard of this game and maybe haven't heard some of your lectures?
Sure. Well, yeah, I'll do my best. So John Conway's Game of Life the reason I use this system is because it shows how very simple systems of interacting components can generate great complexity. And John Conway's Game of Life it's called a zero-player game. It's called a cellular automaton. So what this is, in its most basic and well-known form, is a two-dimensional grid of squares that can be called cells that can be either dead or alive. They can be either in one of two states. And each cell on this infinite grid, two-dimensional grid, updates at every time step, and it will either, if it's alive, it will either stay alive or it will die, and if it's dead, it will either remain dead or it will come alive. And whether that happens is based upon the numbers of neighbors. If it has too many neighbors, it will die of overcrowding. If it doesn't have enough living neighbors, it will die of loneliness. These are all really anthropomorphisms, really. It's not really loneliness, but it's just these simple rules. But through these very simple rules, you get extremely complex behavior, even with the very, very simple rules of this particular cellular automaton. Now, what happens with this when you run this system, this game, you get more and more complex behavior. And in a sufficiently large example of this game, you can actually imagine layers and layers of complexity. We live in a world that is built on layers and layers of complexity. If you think about the ground of reality, you might have superstrings, or whatever. You have something very, very simple, and then you get organizations of these that form the subatomic particles, the electrons, the quarks, the Higgs boson, and then these form atoms. These atoms then form more complex structures we call molecules, and these molecules then form very complex structures that we call living cells, and these cells form organs, etc., all the way to these very complex conscious beings like ourselves. But we have layers of organization. But the idea of the Game of Life is that at the ground of reality could be something very, very simple, something like the Game of Life. This idea goes back to primarily a computer scientist called Ed Fredkin. This is something called digital physics, the idea that at the ground of reality is really digital. It's based on a few very, very simple rules. So space at the ground of reality is kind of like a grid, like you imagine a cubic grid, and each cell of this cubic grid can be in one of a number of states, and the states update at each click of time, and this generates the enormous complexity that we see in the world. But the grid at the base of reality is lost. Now, if we go back to John Conway's Game of Life, it's a 2D cellular automaton. Now, if you stack these up together, um, you basically have a stack of 2D automata. But what you can do is, if you change the rules slightly, you can change the rules so that each cell not only takes into account the cells surrounding it, what we call the neighborhood, in its own sort of 2D slice, but it can actually start to take into account cells in the north and south direction, if you like. And what that means is that the complex structures that form on the 2D slice can at one point be part of the kind of 2D reality. But when the behavior changes slightly or is perturbed in a certain way, you can get information transfer from the other slices, so from the third dimension. So if you imagine some being formed, it's on this two-dimensional game of life. If you perturbed it in some way, it could suddenly start experiencing. It would suddenly sort of burst into a third dimension. It would suddenly find itself in this third dimension. So it's kind of abstract. But when you think about what DMT is doing, in my opinion, is it's changing the computational structure of the brain such that the brain can access information from an orthogonal dimension. So dimensions that are beyond our normal reality that we normally have no access to. And that kind of explains why when people take DMT, they kind of burst into what appears to be a hyperdimensional space, a higher dimensional space, where they're seeing all sides of an object at once. That they're seeing things that appear to be completely impossible. They're tossed 9-dimensional objects from elf beings across hyperspace, this kind of thing. This kind of thing can be explained if the brain is normally kind of like a lower dimensional, 3-dimensional slice of a higher dimensional processor. And DMT changes the computational nature of the brain such that it can access these orthogonal dimensions.
Why do you think the brain... I mean, if this is true, what you're saying, why do you think the brain has evolved to have this function, the ability to perceive higher dimensions under this DMT state?
This is a really good question. So this comes down to, why DMT? Why don't other drugs do this? And perhaps they do. I mean, one thing about the information generated by the brain is that it's extremely flexible, it's extremely complex, and it can be modulated in real time. So information is generated by the brain at the level of the cortex. These interactions between the billions of neurons in your brain generate this information and it is your world. But this information can also flow through organizational layers. And we call this bottom-up and top-down causation, or more intuitively, bottom-up and top-down information flow. So information generated at one level of the organizational hierarchy can flow down. And it's my belief that information, the highly complex, hyperstructured information generated when DMT is in the brain flows very efficiently down to perhaps the ground of reality, and that actually gates some of these kind of fundamental ground of reality cell states that allows information then to pass from these orthogonal dimensions to our dimension and then travel bottom up in the opposite direction back to the brain and modulate the ongoing activity of the brain. So the brain is essentially sending information down towards this orthogonal dimension and then receiving it back. And this establishes the interaction between the brain and this orthogonal dimension. But that doesn't answer the question, why DMT? And that's a really interesting question, because DMT has these really interesting chemical and pharmacological peculiarities. It seems to have this very curious affinity with the human brain. For example, the lack of subjective tolerance to DMT is quite striking. Rick Strassman, in his 95 study, was it 95? I forget. But anyway, he showed that repeated doses of DMT don't exhibit subjective tolerance. This is quite striking because with all the other tryptamine psychedelics, they do exhibit quite rapid and dramatic tolerance. Also, the way that DMT is transported into the brain and packaged into synaptic vesicles is also indicates that there's some kind of relationship, I think, with DMT and the human brain. Now, I'm not one of this sort of the pineal crowd anymore. I think it's unlikely that the pineal gland produces sufficient DMT for it to be, psychedelic concentrations in the brain. But I get the feeling that perhaps some people have suggested, Peter Meyer, who worked with Terence McKenna on his Time Wave Zero software, thinks that perhaps DMT is secreted prenatally. And so there are high levels of DMT in the developing fetus. And perhaps this allows the developing fetus to receive information from these orthogonal dimensions. And this would explain why the brain is so good at constructing this DMT world. Is because it's done it before. And of course, people always say when they go into DMT, "Oh, I've been here before. This is so, this profound sense of deja vu. I've been in this world before. I've kind of been welcomed home, if you like." This would be explained if DMT has this long-standing relationship with the human brain.
But DMT, it gets. The body has also evolved to break it down really quickly, and that's why something like ayahuasca is such a breakthrough when it was discovered, because they found a way to inhibit the enzymes that actually break it down. So why do you think the brain, the same token, evolved not to be able to perceive these realities and be able to sort of break down the DMT really quickly?
Well, I mean, if you think about any normal neuromodulator in the brain, like serotonin or acetylcholine, these are broken down extremely quickly. And in fact, the enzymes that break down acetylcholine esterase, are some of the fastest that we know about. And this is really important. The brain wants to secrete these chemicals, but then remove them extremely quickly. Otherwise, you lose any sense of control, right? If your brain is if a neuron is squirting serotonin into the brain, and this isn't controlled and removed, after it's required, then you lose this ability to sculpt the information that the brain generates. So it's not surprising that the brain, if it does have this relationship, the brain has learned to break it down as quickly as it is sequestered into the brain. So that doesn't concern me. I wouldn't expect an endogenous molecule to hang around for a long time. Often it's non-endogenous molecules, the foreign molecules that are introduced into the body that take a long time to be broken down, simply because the body doesn't have the enzymes that have evolved specifically to break these things down. We have enzymes that are specifically designed to break down monoamines, and that's for very good reason, because the monoamines are some of the most important neurotransmitters in the brain. So that makes sense to me, I think.
You talked about DMT, and compared to something like LSD or psilocybin, DMT is a much, much different experience. And pharmacologically, there's many similarities between DMT and these other psychedelics. But DMT is very intense and very much different compared to those type of psychedelics. So what is it about DMT that makes the experience so profoundly different from any of the other psychedelics?
Yeah, well, the answer is no one really knows. I mean, as you say, the primary locus for their action appears to be the 5-HT2A serotonin receptor. And they all bind slightly differently. Pharmacology, particularly neuropharmacology, is very complex. So a drug, it's not just about a drug binding to a receptor. It's about what does the drug do to the receptor when it's bound. A drug binding to a receptor is a protein. It's this folded structure. There's a very precise shape. When a drug binds to it, it distorts its shape. So a receptor is embedded in the membrane of a neuron. When a drug binds, it distorts the shape, and that changes the way that receptor interacts with other proteins on the inside of the cell, and this causes the effect on the cell. So some drugs will bind to the receptor and do nothing. These are called antagonists. Some will have a very strong effect in a certain particular way. Agonists, we call these. Some drugs are kind of in between. They have a kind of a weaker effect. And these are called partial agonists. And kind of the classical idea is that the classical psychedelics are partial agonists at the 5-HT2A receptor. But actually, this kind of assumes that there's only one way to activate a receptor, and that turns out not to be the case. is that different drugs will bind to the same receptor but have a very different effect on the cell, because they each distort the receptor in a slightly different way and have a slightly different effect on the cell. Now, this has never really been explored in detail. There's a lot of pharmacology that you can read through, but translating that, a lot of the work done by Dave Nichols, for example, and other people who've looked at the signaling pathways inside the cells, but relating that to what goes on at the global level, i.e. the global brain levels, what goes on in terms of the changes in consciousness, that's still largely unexplored. People are spending a lot of money and a lot of time looking at functional neuroimaging, particularly the Imperial team, who've done some really important and quite famous studies now in the last few years with LSD, psilocybin, and now DMT, the ongoing study, looking at changes in brain activity. But how you can map the changes in brain activity in an fMRI machine, but how you then relate that to what's going on at the molecular level is very, very complicated. And that really takes someone who can straddle several layers of organization. You need someone who understands the molecular pharmacology, someone who understands the systems biology of all these kind of complex network of molecules within the cell, and someone then can relate that to what goes on at the neural network level, and then someone who can translate that into what goes on in terms of changes in the way that you see the world. So really, no one really knows is the answer, I'm afraid, at this stage.
Now, this idea how the brain, the connectivity of certain areas of the brain sort of changes under DMT, which gives us the ability to possibly tap into other dimensions. This is really a new idea in the sense that it's coming from someone from the scientific community who has the credibility to legitimize this type of hypothesis. So I was just wondering, just the backstory, like how did you personally come across these concepts, and just personally, how just the backstory behind that paper that you wrote?
So the first paper, Building Alien Worlds.
Yeah, just this body of sort of work that you've been known for over the last few years.
Yeah, so I guess I'm very interested in the way the brain builds the world, and I'm very interested in the idea of information, neural information. So I really try to think about, if people say, DMT cannot allow you to access an alternate universe, and you get these very kind of vague, kind of hand wavy explanation. They say, oh, it's like, tuning a radio to a different channel, people say, and then people go, oh, that makes sense. But actually, does it make sense? What do you mean the brain is tuned to a different channel? And so I've really tried to use actual kind of hard neuroscience, but also borrowing from information theory, borrowing from computational science, and borrowing from a number of other disciplines to try and break it down. What would be required, first of all, for DMT to actually allow you to access another world? And straight away there, you can simplify the problem. People say, DMT allows you to travel to another world. Well, no, it doesn't have to do that. All that DMT has to do is allow information to be transmitted from that alternate reality, that orthogonal dimension, into your brain. So this already you've formalized the problem a little bit better, and then from there you can think about, well, how does the brain generate information? From what? But then you're still kind of lost, because you kind of can't think of how information. I call this the data input problem. How does information from an alternate reality get into a human brain? It's clearly not through the normal sensory conduits. It's not through the visual, directly through the visual system or the auditory system. It seems to be like a direct transfer of information into the brain. So to really understand that, you have to start thinking about really the structure of reality. You've got to start thinking about the structure of the world, and you've really then got to get into fundamental theories of reality, and I'm not sold on which is the best fundamental theory of reality, but digital physics provides a very useful way of getting in there. Because of its discrete nature, and these beautiful models, these cellular automata like Conway's Game of Life, allow you to really formalize your thinking and think about exactly what would be required. What does the brain have to do? What does DMT have to do to the brain in order to allow it to receive information from these normally inaccessible orthogonal dimensions? So that's really what I've been doing. The 2012 paper, Building Alien Worlds, was more biological. It was very speculative. I had lots of ideas thinking in there, really just trying to put to bed the idea that we can simply dismiss DMT as pure hallucination, mere hallucination. That's really what that was about. And I had, some speculative hypotheses, ideas about evolution in there. But really from there, I've moved into really starting to think about, what is the mechanism? If DMT does allow interdimensional communication, let's take that seriously. What does that require? What could be the mechanism? And so this book that I'm writing at the moment, Alien Information Theory, it really looks at, going from the ground up, starting from, the ground of reality, and then explaining how complex structures emerge, including brains, for example, how they construct worlds, and what DMT and other psychedelic drugs do to this complex informational structure that we call a brain, and how that might allow us to access these orthogonal dimensions, what we experience as the DMT world, if you like.
Now, a common account, like you were saying, for those who have experienced DMT is regularly people say they have contact with these advanced alien beings and oftentimes elves. It's just so common for people that have taken this psychedelic. So can you talk about some of these reports people are having, and just some of the accounts that you've seen, I guess, from studies and papers that's out there?
Sure. I mean, so there are a number of common features. I mean, I'm actually currently in the process of using Rick Strassman's original bedside notes. So when Rick Strassman did his original study in the early 90s in New Mexico, he took copious bedside notes of the trip reports of all of his participants. A select number of these were published in his book DMT: The Spirit Molecule, but the vast majority of them were left out, and they've never been formally studied. So actually, I managed to convince Rick to actually remove all of the private data from all of these trip reports that would identify anybody who didn't want to be identified, and I actually have all of these reports now, and we've kind of have been in the process for some time with Dr. David Luke, who is another prominent DMT researcher at Greenwich University, to actually analyze these formally. Look at what kind of entities, what kind of beings do people see, and they vary widely. So elves are perhaps the most famous denizens of hyperspace that everybody talks about. But also all the way from elves through to reptilians, through to insectoids, through to more kind of amorphous beings of light. And their character can be extremely variable. They can be extremely benevolent, wise, loving, kind of teacher kind of figures, all the way through to people who will beings that will hurt you, rape you, eat you, so it's extremely variable, and the question is how variable is it? We all hear stories. We all read trip reports on Erowid, for example, and we're able to sort of cherry pick the reports that we kind of find interesting, and then we might draw kind of perhaps biased conclusions about, the prominence of the elves, for example. And then, of course, there's the McKenna effect. People say, well, Terence McKenna spoke about the elves a lot, which is why everyone sees elves. So it's overdue, I think, that people actually looked at these these reports of entities a little bit more formally. And so what we're actually doing is to take Rick Strassman's reports, which were obviously retrieved under controlled conditions. Everyone was under the same kind of conditions, the same room, injected the drug in the same way. And then look at the distribution of these different types of beings that people experience, and then compare that to somewhere like Erowid, where people have a whole range of different conditions under which they took the drug, and actually see, is there a variation? are these entities context independent? And if, in other words, do people see the same entities no matter under what circumstances? This old idea of set and setting is essential for psychedelics. I think that's certainly true with DMT. What is your mindset? What is your setting? Where are you? Who are you with? I think these are important, but the DMT seems to transcend set and setting in a sense. It seems to transcend individual psychological idiosyncrasies. It seems to be a sort of mind set and setting independent to an extent. And if we could show this, that would go some way to saying that actually the DMT isn't just hallucination, but it seems to be related to something that's going on external to the brain, perhaps.
Are there any common messages or themes that these beings are wanting to convey to humans when they are on DMT, based off of the notes that you've seen and read?
Sure. Well, there are some messages are kind of ecological messages, and they're actually kind of similar to I don't know if you know John Mack, who was a Harvard psychiatrist who did a large number of studies with people who have been abducted by aliens over a number of years, and he couldn't find anything psychologically wrong with these people, and yet they'd had these extremely bizarre and yet often very, very similar experiences, and often the aliens would give them these sort of ecological messages, about looking after the earth and that kind of thing, and that's interesting to an extent, but it's a little bit less interesting from my perspective. Not that these aren't important issues, but of course, a being. Even if you hallucinate a being, it might give you a message. You need to look after the earth, and particularly if you're an ecologically minded person anyway. And often people who use psychedelics often are. That's perhaps not so surprising. So I'm kind of interested when they have very, very strange messages, messages about the structure of reality, and I'm interested in. I'm not a proponent of simulated universe theory, but I've actually I wrote a paper called Building Human Worlds: DMT and the Simulated Universe, in which I actually talk about the relationship perhaps between DMT and this idea that we live in some sort of a simulation, and whether the beings that built this simulation, which of course would be extremely intelligent beings, whether they would eventually want us to find out that we were living in a simulation, and perhaps whether they would actually leave clues, messages that could only be decoded once we developed the requisite degree of sort of cognitive sophistication, such as isolating this ubiquitous molecule that's found throughout the natural world that we call DMT, and that could be the clue, if you like. And people, so that was kind of an idea I had, kind of trying to connect DMT to simulated universe theory, just for fun, really. But then you hear all these reports, and I posted this essay when it was published on DMT Nexus. And people said, yeah, I agree with you. And I've had many aliens, tell me that we live in a simulated universe. And it's something that I've experienced as well. I remember being sat in kind of an alien boardroom where they were discussing, whether or not to switch off the simulation, which was kind of rather alarming. I don't know if they were just playing with me or what, but...
Now, you were speaking about some of these beings are evil. I mean, not all of them have the best intentions and are wise. Some, like you were saying, are out to rape you or eat you or, just to do bad things to you. And there's some people that have taken DMT and have had really just to the core frightening experiences that really shook them for life. So can you talk about some of these evil beings and what's going on there?
Sure. I mean, these are, fortunately, they're not that common. Most encounter with entities are positive, perhaps extremely strange or bizarre, but there's not normally evil intent. That's not always the case, however. Some degree of, even going back to the earlier studies with Stephen Zara. Stephen Zara was the Hungarian chemist who discovered the psychedelic effects of DMT, of pure DMT anyway, not counting the indigenous tribes, which kind of knew about this a long time ago. And he, in his earlier studies, he had a patient that experienced what she described as horrible orange people that were hurting her. And this kind of struck me as being kind of similar to some of these kind of negative experiences that people have. And often it's people being experimented upon, as if like kind of similar to the grey alien experiences, but not necessarily grey aliens as such, where they're being prodded, they're being carried to rooms where they're being experimented on, and often it's not particularly pleasant. Sometimes the beings are outright nasty. So there's a notable example in Rick Strassman's book where these alligators that are kind of raping the subject, and that is not. It's fairly rare, but there's more than one case of that of people who are raped and then eaten, for example, by these these kind of reptilian entities. But it's and then there are just experiences that are shocking and bone shaking, soul shaking for very different reasons, often for quite indescribable reasons. Where people get taken in, get lost in kind of infinite time loops where they're lost for an all eternity. And these, to me, more the frightening experiences. As long as you don't forget that you're on DMT, and that's often a problem, is you forget you've taken the drug. You can deal with, you can train yourself really to deal with these negative entities. They only have you for. Graham Hancock recounts a wonderful story, absolutely appalling bad trip. I guess you would call it. With very negative entities. And they said, we've got you now. And he said, yeah, but only for 15 minutes, right? As long as you remember that you're on this drug, that they really don't have you forever. It might feel like that. But as Gracian Zarkov used to say, trust in your own wetware. You will come back. That's very difficult. I mean, that's it's lovely to say that, of course. But when you're in this place, when you're stuck in this infinite time loop with some beings that are kind of raping you or tearing your soul apart, it's very difficult. But fortunately, it's not that common.
Now, these encounters with the alien beings, with elves, oftentimes it is, especially with aliens, it's people also experience this in the dream state. So I was going to ask, how does DMT in the dream state relate to the numerous reports of alien encounters?
Well, I mean, in my opinion, the dream state is orthogonal to the DMT. The dream state is continuous with the waking state normally, and the DMT state normally has no relationship to that whatsoever. I'm not convinced that dreaming of aliens is comparable to being confronted with these beings in the DMT space, where they are more real than real. I think it's probably an unrelated experience, but perhaps you don't.
Well, another thing I was going to ask, and just switching things up, is DMT is extremely short acting, although it can feel like several hours. But in normal perceived reality, it only lasts a few minutes. So when you brought up, the recent paper about continuous DMT administration, it was really exciting for a lot of people. So can you talk a little bit about this paper, how we could possibly use techniques from, anesthesiologists to administer drip feed DMT for long stretches of time?
Sure. So the idea came to me. I was thinking about the potential, the idea that if we really want to establish communication with, if we take the idea that DMT does allow you to access an alternate universe, how could we extend and establish stable communication? People say, well, you use ayahuasca, and that's the obvious answer. But ayahuasca is very different. Ayahuasca is a very variable experience. It's accompanied by violent purging It's the levels of DMT actually in the brain in the ayahuasca state are actually relatively low. They're only about a fifth or a sixth of what is actually achieved during a high dose DMT trip. And they fluctuate, they go up and down, depending on, pharmacokinetic factors. So ayahuasca is certainly a beautiful technology, but it's not stable, a stable breakthrough experience that could last several hours at all. So my feeling was that we need to, bring our best tools to the table here, use our best technology. And DMT, it struck me, has a number of pharmacological peculiarities, which I spoke about earlier, including, most importantly, a lack of subjective tolerance to its effect, which means that you can either give someone repeated doses or you can give someone a continuous dose, and that the effect won't diminish. But also, it's very short acting. It also lacks toxicity. It has all of these qualities that are also shared by a group of drugs called anesthetics. And in fact, certain class of anesthetics, these short-acting anesthetics that they use to in these continuous intravenous infusion models. So when you go for surgery, the anesthesiologist won't just give you a single, what's called a bolus injection of the drug, but they will give you a small amount. They will give you a large bolus injection to kind of induce you into sleep. But then they will have a continuous infusion of the drug that allow them to basically maintain the level of drug in your brain so that they can keep you asleep. But what's beautiful about this method is they can adjust the level of drug in the brain in real time. So they can bring you slightly out of the anesthesia, to prevent toxic effects, or if the surgeon is doing a deep cut, for example, they might push you deeper in and increase the level of of anesthetic in your brain. And there's a whole technology and science behind this. This is not straightforward to do, as you can imagine. It's not just about plugging someone in and switching it on and injecting, at any old kind of infusion rate. You have to get the infusion rate absolutely right, and it's based upon individual factors. And you have to develop what's called a pharmacokinetic model. And what this is you inject someone with the drug and you follow the level of the drug in their blood over time. And from this, you can then develop an understanding of how the drug is passing from the bloodstream into the tissues and into the brain, and how it's being excreted. And you build a mathematical model of this. And using this mathematical model, you can then program an infusion machine to infuse the right amount of the drug per unit time, per second, into your bloodstream to keep the level of drug in your brain constant. And this is really important, of course. If you infuse too quickly, you could kill somebody. They might stop breathing. Or of course, if the infusion rate is too slow, they might come out of the anesthesia at the most inopportune time, when their chest is open, or when their head is open, or something like this. So my feeling was, well, why can't we use this technology for DMT? It has all of the properties of these anesthetic drugs. Why can't we develop a model? So I thought, this will be really useful, because if we could keep the level of DMT in the brain stable, we could induce someone into a breakthrough state, and then keep the level in the brain constant. So keep them there, and for an hour, 2 hours, for any length of time really that you wanted, you could hold them there. And so the only thing I needed to do that was a pharmacokinetic model, a mathematical model. And for that, you need blood data. So I emailed Rick and said, Rick, do you actually have the actual blood data that you had, that you got from your study in the 90s? This is early 90s, so this is a long time ago. 25 years ago now. But within 30 minutes, I got this old kind of Microsoft Excel file that had his data in there. So I was able to extract the blood data from his original study, and then use that to construct a pharmacokinetic model, which then allowed us to demonstrate, as a proof of principle, that the pharmacological properties of DMT mean that this kind of continuous intravenous infusion, what's called target-controlled intravenous infusion technique, that's used in anesthesiology would actually work with DMT. And so that was what this paper was about, really as a proof of principle.
It's really exciting, like I was saying, because DMT, it's known as a businessman's trip. So it only lasts for about 15 minutes. So if you could put someone in that state for a number of hours, who knows the type of things that you could explore. So I was wondering, what type of tests would you most excite you in the future that you'd like to see explored with this type of method?
Well, so there's a number of possibilities. Initially what you would try and do is simply to, it's not even clear how someone would actually respond to that, to being in the DMT space for that period of time. So I think that there would be a lot of work to actually develop the model in humans, to actually induce people into these states and actually observe how DMT behaves with this infusion protocol, and actually allow someone to kind of to stabilize themselves within this state and get their kind of intellective tools in order, as I put it, so that they can then perform perhaps experiments. Now, what kind of experiments, you might ask? Well, initially, my feeling this would be rather open-ended. The idea would be to establish some kind of dialogue, perhaps to establish repeated meetings with the same entity. To spend more than just a few minutes as you're kind of cascading through this very complex, unstable environment, to actually spend some time, really sit down, in a sense, in a kind of metaphorical sense, with one of these entities and actually establish some sort of communication, get some kind of message. Then, people say, well, you should ask them, you should try and make them prove that they exist. And this is something I'm always slightly concerned about, this idea that we should give them tests. There have been the paper published a few years ago now that suggests that we should give them mathematical problems to solve. To demonstrate that they're actually independent of your mind. A mathematical problem, the factorization of large, prime factorization of very large numbers, I think was the technique they were suggesting, something that humans could never do in their head. But that would be one approach. To kind of probe the ontology of these beings to establish whether they really are independent of our minds or not. But anything you want, establishing communication would be the first thing, I think. And ask, what have you got to tell us? I always think it's people. The responses to this technology, this new kind of method, have been mixed. Some people have been say, "Oh, this is really amazing. We're really interested in doing this." And I've had countless emails from people wanting to volunteer. Not that I'm actually currently recruiting people, by the way. Whereas some people say, "Wow, this is terrible. This ayahuasca is the way that you should be consuming DMT," and I don't agree with this at all. But largely, it's been fairly positive. But time will tell. We have a number. There's at least one group who are really serious about implementing this technology over in the States, in Colorado, in Boulder. Medicinal mindfulness, led by a guy called Daniel McQueen, who's actually went over to Boulder this summer and gave a talk, which is now on my YouTube channel. And they're very interested in this, what we call the extended state DMT research, because the possibilities are endless, really.
Well, Andrew, thanks so much for sitting down with me. If people want to learn more about you and your work and your upcoming book that's going to come out, where can they best find all that good stuff online?
Yeah, if you go to my website, www.buildingalienworlds.com, all one word, Building Alien Worlds, you got all of my papers and my interviews and videos and all that kind of stuff, and all the information about the book, once it's available, will be on there as well.
All right. Thanks, Andrew, for sitting down with me. This was one of the more fascinating interviews we've had on Warrior Radio. Go check out his website, buildingalienworlds.com, and there you'll get all of his papers and hopefully his book, which will come out soon. I want to say thank you for sitting down with me today. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to subscribe to the podcast Warrior Radio. Subscribe, give us a rating, and tell a friend. And we can get a lot of these little known topics out into the world. So again, thank you so much for sitting down with me, and I will see you on the next one. Take care. Bye-bye.